Sinclair's heart pounded in her chest as she followed the mysterious woman through the twisted maze of the underground complex. The sounds of pursuit grew louder with each step, the relentless footfalls of their adversaries closing in. "We're almost there," the woman said, her voice low and urgent. "Just a little further." Sinclair's mind raced, the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She knew that her team was counting on her, that the fate of humanity hung in the balance, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead filled her with a sense of dread. As they rounded a corner, Sinclair caught a glimpse of their destination, a heavily fortified door guarded by a small group of armed men. The woman tensed, her grip tightening on her weapon. "Stay behind me," she commanded, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of an opening. Sinclair obeyed, her heart pounding as the woman charged forward, a barrage of gunfire erupting around them. She watched, transfixed, as the woman moved with a fluid grace, dispatching the guards with a precision that belied her apparent expertise. But just as Sinclair thought they were in the clear, a deafening explosion rocked the corridor, sending debris and shrapnel flying in all directions. She felt a searing pain in her side as she was thrown to the ground, the air knocked from her lungs. As the dust settled, Sinclair found herself alone, the woman nowhere to be seen. Panic gripped her as she struggled to her feet, her eyes searching frantically for any sign of her savior. "No, no, no," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with desperation. "I can't fail them. Not now." With gritted teeth, Sinclair pressed forward, her steps unsteady, but her determination unwavering. She reached the fortified door, her fingers fumbling with the keypad as she desperately tried to gain access. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Sinclair found herself face to face with a group of armed men, their weapons trained on her. She froze, her heart sinking as she realized that her team had been discovered. "Well, well, well," a familiar voice drawled. "Look what we have here." Sinclair's eyes narrowed as the mercenary leader emerged from the shadows, a twisted grin plastered across his face. "I must say, I'm impressed," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "You managed to evade us for quite some time. But now, it's time to face the consequences of your actions." Sinclair felt a surge of defiance rise within her, but before she could respond, the mercenary raised his hand, signaling his men to move in. In a blur of motion, Sinclair found herself surrounded, her hands bound behind her back, as the mercenaries dragged her into the fortified room. Her eyes swept the space, her heart sinking as she caught sight of her team, their faces etched with a mix of fear and resignation. "No," she whispered, the weight of her failure crushing her. The mercenary leader stepped forward, his cold eyes boring into hers. "You should have taken the deal, Doctor. Now, you and your team are going to pay the price." Sinclair felt a wave of helplessness wash over her, her mind racing for a way out of this seemingly impossible situation. But as she looked into the faces of her colleagues, she knew that she couldn't give up, not when so much was at stake. With a deep breath, she steeled herself, her gaze unwavering as she met the mercenary's stare. "You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. The cure is out there, and you'll never be able to stop it." The mercenary's expression darkened, and Sinclair braced herself for the worst, knowing that the fight for humanity's survival was far from over. As the days turned into weeks, the team's progress on the potential cure seemed to crawl at a torturously slow pace. The virus continued to spread like wildfire, decimating city after city, and leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Sinclair and her colleagues worked tirelessly, their sleep-deprived eyes scanning reams of data and running countless simulations. The breakthrough they had discovered in the genetic markers was proving to be a crucial lead, but the path to a viable cure was fraught with unexpected challenges. "The compound we synthesized shows promising results in the lab, but we're still struggling to find an effective delivery method," Volkov said, his brow furrowed in frustration. "The virus is mutating faster than we can keep up with." Sinclair pressed her lips into a thin line, her fingers drumming against the edge of the table. We don't have the luxury of time. The infection rates are spiraling out of control, and the death toll is staggering. We need to get this cure into the hands of the people, and we need to do it now. Liam, his eyes sunken with exhaustion, spoke up from the corner of the lab. I may have an idea, but it's risky. We could try to aerosolize the compound, allowing for widespread distribution. But the stability of the formula would be a major concern, and the potential for unintended consequences is high. Sinclair considered his proposal, weighing the risks and potential rewards. We don't have any other viable options on the table. At this point, we have to be willing to take calculated risks. Liam, get your team working on the aerosolization process immediately. Volkov, I want you to start planning for large-scale distribution protocols. We need to be ready to deploy as soon as the compound is stable. The team sprang into action, their urgency fueled by the knowledge that the fate of humanity hung in the balance. Sinclair watched them work, her mind racing with the implications of their actions. Little did she know, their breakthrough had not gone unnoticed. Powerful forces, driven by greed and a lust for control, had infiltrated their network and were closing in on the lab's location. Shadowy figures moved in the periphery, gathering intelligence and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the team made their final preparations for the deployment of the aerosolized cure, a deafening explosion rocked the laboratory, sending shockwaves through the underground complex. Sinclair and her colleagues scrambled to secure their research and escape the chaos, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. In the aftermath of the attack, Sinclair gathered the remaining members of her team, their faces etched with a grim realization. They know, she said, her voice low and urgent. We've been compromised, and they're coming for us. We have to get the cure out there, no matter the cost. With a resolute nod, the team sprang into action, their focus laser-sharp as they prepared to face the unknown. Sinclair knew that the path ahead would be treacherous, but she refused to back down. The fate of the world depended on their success, and she would stop at nothing to ensure humanity's survival. As they braced themselves for the coming storm, Sinclair steeled her nerves, her determination unwavering. "We're humanity's last hope," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her team. "Let's make sure we don't let them down." The deafening explosion had shaken the team to their core, but they quickly regained their composure, driven by the urgency of their mission. Sinclair gathered her colleagues, her eyes sweeping across their weary faces. "We've been compromised," she said, her voice low and tense. "They know about the cure, and they're coming for us. We need to get the aerosolized compound out there as quickly as possible, but we can't risk leading them straight to it." Volkov, his brow furrowed with concern, stepped forward. "We'll need to split up and create a diversion. That will buy us time to distribute the cure without being tracked." Sinclair nodded, her mind racing with contingency plans. "Liam, you and your team will oversee the final preparations for the deployment. Volkov, take the rest of the team and set up a series of decoys and false trails to throw off our pursuers. I'll stay behind and try to stall them as long as I can." The team members exchanged a series of solemn glances, each of them acutely aware of the risks they were about to undertake. Sinclair placed a reassuring hand on Liam's shoulder, her gaze unwavering. "You've all done remarkable work," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now it's time to put it to the test. Get that cure out there, no matter what happens to me." Liam opened his mouth to protest, but Sinclair silenced him with a firm shake of her head. "There's no time to argue. Go now. I'll do what I can to buy you as much time as possible." With a heavy heart, the team split up, each member taking on their assigned task. Sinclair watched them go, her mind already racing with the contingencies she would need to put in place. As the sounds of the pursuit closed in, Sinclair quickly set to work, rigging a series of explosive devices and setting up tactical defensive positions throughout the lab. She knew that her time was limited, but she was determined to make it as difficult as possible for her pursuers to reach the precious cargo. Just as the first of the intruders burst through the doors, Sinclair opened fire, her aim precise and her movements fluid. She fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that every second she could buy her team was a second closer to the successful deployment of the cure. But the enemy was relentless, and Sinclair soon found herself outmatched and outgunned. As she retreated deeper into the lab, her ammunition running low, she realized that she was nearing the end of her ability to stall. With a heavy heart, she activated the final detonation sequence, setting off a series of explosions that rocked the underground complex. The air filled with the acrid stench of smoke and the sound of collapsing debris, and Sinclair knew that her time had run out. As the dust settled, she found herself surrounded by the enemy, their weapons trained on her. She met their gaze with defiance, her chin held high. "You're too late," she said, her voice barely betraying the fear that gripped her. "The cure is already out there, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The leader of the group, a cold-eyed mercenary, regarded her with a twisted smile. "Maybe so, but that doesn't mean we can't make you talk. You're going to tell us everything you know, one way or another." Sinclair steeled herself, knowing that the battle was far from over. She had bought her team the time they needed, and she would do whatever it took to protect the cure, even if it meant facing the ultimate sacrifice. As the dust settled in the aftermath of the explosions, Dr. Evelyn Sinclair found herself surrounded by the enemy, her defiant gaze meeting the cold, unforgiving eyes of the mercenary leader. "You're going to tell us everything you know," the mercenary said, his voice laced with menace, "one way or another." Sinclair stared him down, her heart pounding in her chest, but her resolve never wavering. "I'll never betray my team or the work we've done. The cure is already out there, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The mercenary's lip curled into a sneer. "We'll see about that." He nodded to his men, who quickly moved to restrain Sinclair, binding her hands and dragging her deeper into the ruined laboratory. Sinclair's mind raced as she was led through the devastation, her eyes searching for any sign of her colleagues. She knew that Liam and the others had successfully initiated the deployment of the aerosolized cure, but she also knew that the battle was far from over. As they reached a makeshift command center, the mercenary leader turned to Sinclair, his gaze cold and calculating. "You're going to tell us everything you know about the cure, its distribution, and the locations of your team. And you're going to do it quickly, before we run out of patience." Sinclair's jaw tightened, and she fought the urge to spit in the man's face. "I told you, I won't betray my team. You can do whatever you want to me, but I'll never help you." The mercenary's expression darkened, and he nodded to one of his men. Sinclair braced herself, but the blow never came. Instead, the man she had come to know as Liam stepped forward, his face a mask of anguish. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let them." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sinclair's eyes widened with a mixture of shock and understanding. "Liam, what have you done?" Liam's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands trembling. "They threatened to kill the others if I didn't cooperate. I had to do something, Evelyn. I couldn't let them all die." Sinclair felt her heart sink, the weight of Liam's betrayal crushing her. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the torment and the anguish that he was clearly experiencing. She knew, in that moment, that he had made an impossible choice, and that he was bearing the burden of that decision. "Enough of this," the mercenary leader barked, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Tell us what we want to know, or your friend here pays the price." Sinclair felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, but in the depths of her despair, a glimmer of hope began to take root. If Liam had managed to secure the cure's distribution, then there was still a chance. With a deep breath, Sinclair steeled herself and met the mercenary's gaze. "I'll tell you what you want to know," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "But first, I need you to understand something. The cure is already out there, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. No matter what happens to me, humanity will survive." The mercenary's eyes narrowed, and he opened his mouth to speak, but Sinclair cut him off. "So if you want to know where the cure is, you'll have to pry it from my cold, dead hands." As the mercenary's expression darkened, Sinclair braced herself for the worst, knowing that she had done everything in her power to protect the fragile hope that her team had fought so hard to secure. As the mercenary leader's rage boiled over, Sinclair tensed, preparing herself for whatever horrors were to come. But before the man could unleash his fury, a deafening explosion rocked the makeshift command center, drawing everyone's attention. In the ensuing chaos, Sinclair caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, a figure slipping silently through the debris, approaching the mercenaries with deadly precision. She watched in stunned silence as the mysterious intruder struck, dispatching the guards with a series of swift, calculated strikes. When the dust settled, Sinclair found herself face to face with a woman clad in a tattered tactical gear, her eyes shielded by a dark hood. The woman raised a finger to her lips, signaling Sinclair to remain silent. "Who are you?" Sinclair whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "A friend," the woman replied, her voice low and urgent. "We need to get you out of here, Doctor. Your team is counting on you." Sinclair's mind raced, torn between the desire to escape and the need to protect the precious cure. "My team, the cure. I can't leave them behind." The woman's expression hardened. "There's no time to argue. The deployment is already underway, but your pursuers will be relentless. You need to get to safety and ensure the cure reaches its intended targets." Sinclair wavered, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. But the woman's words struck a chord, reminding her of the larger stakes at play. "All right," she said, steeling her resolve. "Let's go." The woman quickly cut Sinclair's bonds and led her through the devastated laboratory, navigating a maze of rubble and debris. As they moved, Sinclair caught glimpses of the chaos unfolding around them. The sounds of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, and the palpable sense of desperation. "Who are these people?" Sinclair asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mercenaries, hired guns, and corporate shills," the woman replied, her tone laced with disdain. "They'll stop at nothing to get their hands on the cure, even if it means destroying everything in their path." Sinclair shuddered, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "Then we need to get the cure to the people who need it most. There's no time to waste." The woman nodded, her pace quickening as they wove through the labyrinth of the underground complex. Suddenly, she paused, her hand raised in a gesture of caution. "We're not alone," she whispered, her eyes scanning the shadows. Sinclair tensed, her heart pounding in her chest as she strained to hear any sign of movement. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of their own labored breathing seemed to echo against the walls. Without warning, a group of armed men emerged from the darkness, their weapons trained on the two women. Sinclair felt her stomach clench with fear, but the woman beside her remained unflinching. "You're not going anywhere," one of the men growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. The woman's response was swift and decisive. In a blur of motion, she drew a concealed weapon and opened fire, dispatching the intruders with ruthless efficiency. Sinclair watched, stunned, as the woman turned to her, her eyes blazing with determination. "We need to move now. There's a safe house not far from here, where you can reach the rest of your team. But we have to go, before more of them show up." Sinclair nodded, her mind racing as she followed the mysterious woman through the labyrinth of the underground complex. She knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but she was more determined than ever to see her mission through to the end. Sinclair's heart pounded in her chest as she followed the mysterious woman through the twisted maze of the underground complex. The sounds of pursuit grew louder with each step, the relentless footfalls of their adversaries closing in. "We're almost there," the woman said, her voice low and urgent. "Just a little further." Sinclair's mind raced, the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She knew that her team was counting on her, that the fate of humanity hung in the balance. but the uncertainty of what lay ahead filled her with a sense of dread. As they rounded a corner, Sinclair caught a glimpse of their destination, a heavily fortified door guarded by a small group of armed men. The woman tensed, her grip tightening on her weapon. "Stay behind me," she commanded, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of an opening. Sinclair obeyed, her heart pounding as the woman charged forward, a barrage of gunfire erupting around them. She watched, transfixed, as the woman moved with a fluid grace, dispatching the guards with a precision that belied her apparent expertise. But just as Sinclair thought they were in the clear, a deafening explosion rocked the corridor, sending debris and shrapnel flying in all directions. She felt a searing pain in her side as she was thrown to the ground, the air knocked from her lungs. As the dust settled, Sinclair found herself alone, the woman nowhere to be seen. Panic gripped her as she struggled to her feet, her eyes searching frantically for any sign of her savior. "No, no, no," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with desperation. "I can't fail them. Not now." With gritted teeth, Sinclair pressed forward, her steps unsteady, but her determination unwavering. She reached the fortified door, her fingers fumbling with the keypad as she desperately tried to gain access. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Sinclair found herself face to face with a group of armed men, their weapons trained on her. She froze, her heart sinking as she realized that her team had been discovered. "Well, well, well," a familiar voice drawled. "Look what we have here." Sinclair's eyes narrowed as the mercenary leader emerged from the shadows, a twisted grin plastered across his face. "I must say, I'm impressed," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "You managed to evade us for quite some time. But now, it's time to face the consequences of your actions." Sinclair felt a surge of defiance rise within her, but before she could respond, the mercenary raised his hand, signaling his men to move in. In a blur of motion, Sinclair found herself surrounded, her hands bound behind her back, as the mercenaries dragged her into the fortified room. Her eyes swept the space, her heart sinking as she caught sight of her team, their faces etched with a mix of fear and resignation. "No," she whispered, the weight of her failure crushing her. The mercenary leader stepped forward, his cold eyes boring into hers. "You should have taken the deal, Doctor. Now, you and your team are going to pay the price." Sinclair felt a wave of helplessness wash over her, her mind racing for a way out of this seemingly impossible situation. But as she looked into the faces of her colleagues, she knew that she couldn't give up, not when so much was at stake. With a deep breath, she steeled herself, her gaze unwavering as she met the mercenary's stare. "You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. The cure is out there, and you'll never be able to stop it." The mercenary's expression darkened, and Sinclair braced herself for the worst, knowing that the fight for humanity's survival was far from over. As the mercenary leader's gaze bore into her, Sinclair felt a surge of defiance rise within her. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to give up now. The fate of humanity depended on her and her team's ability to see this mission through. "You may have won this battle," she said, her voice unwavering, "but the war is far from over. The cure is out there, and you'll never be able to stop it." The mercenary's expression darkened, and Sinclair braced herself for the worst. But before he could react, a sudden commotion erupted from the shadows, drawing the attention of the armed guards. In the chaos, Sinclair caught a glimpse of the mysterious woman from earlier, her weapon blazing as she fought her way through the mercenaries. The woman's eyes locked with Sinclair's, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Seizing the opportunity, Sinclair surged forward, slamming her bound hands into the nearest guard's face. As the man faltered, she quickly retrieved his weapon and turned it on the others, her aim steady and her resolve unyielding. The mercenary leader, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, barked orders at his men, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the woman's relentless assault. Sinclair fought alongside her, their movements in perfect sync as they carved a path through the chaos. "Get to the lab," the woman shouted, her voice barely audible over the din of gunfire. "Your team needs you." Sinclair hesitated, her gaze darting between the woman and the fortified room where her colleagues were being held. "But I can't just leave you." "There's no time to argue," the woman interrupted, her eyes fierce with determination. "I'll hold them off as long as I can. Now go." Sinclair nodded, her heart pounding as she turned and raced towards the lab, her mind consumed by the urgency of her mission. As she navigated the twisting corridors, she could hear the sounds of the battle raging behind her, the echoes of gunfire and the cries of the wounded. Reaching the lab, Sinclair found the door unlocked, and she burst through, her eyes frantically searching for her team. To her relief, they were all there, battered and bruised but alive, their focus unwavering as they continued their work. "Evelyn," Liam exclaimed, his face lighting up with a mixture of shock and hope. "You're alive." Sinclair moved to embrace him, but the gravity of the situation quickly sobered the moment. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The cure, where is it?" Liam's expression grew serious. "It's ready, but the deployment has been compromised. We were ambushed just as we were about to initiate the dispersal." Sinclair felt a surge of desperation. "Then we need to get it out there. Now. Our window of opportunity is closing." Nodding, Liam turned to the rest of the team. "You heard the doctor. Let's move." As the team sprang into action, Sinclair caught sight of a small, nondescript case in the corner of the lab. "Is that it?" she asked, her heart pounding. Liam followed her gaze and nodded. "That's the aerosolized cure. We just need to find a way to get it out there without it falling into the wrong hands." Sinclair's mind raced, her eyes scanning the room for any potential solutions. Suddenly, an idea began to take shape in her mind, one that would require a tremendous sacrifice, but could ultimately save what remained of humanity. "Liam, I need you to trust me," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I have a plan, but it's going to be risky." Liam's eyes widened, but before he could protest, Sinclair placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze unwavering. "We don't have a choice. This is our last chance. Now let's get that cure out there, and make sure it reaches the people who need it most." As the team swung into action, Sinclair's mind raced with the details of her daring plan. She knew the risks were high, but the stakes had never been higher. The fate of humanity hung in the balance, and she was determined to do whatever it took to ensure the cure reached those who needed it most. "Liam, I need you to oversee the dispersal," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "Make sure the aerosolized compound is distributed as widely as possible. Don't hold back. We have to saturate every corner of the affected areas." Liam's eyes widened with a mixture of understanding and trepidation. "Evelyn, what are you?" Sinclair silenced him with a raised hand. "No time to argue. Just do it, and don't look back. The rest of you, go with Liam, and provide support wherever you can. This is our last chance." The team hesitated for a moment, their gazes filled with a mixture of fear and admiration for their fearless leader. But they knew that time was of the essence, and they quickly sprang into action, their movements filled with a newfound urgency. As Lamb and the others rushed to prepare the dispersal, Sinclair turned her attention to the small, nondescript case containing the precious cargo. With a deep breath, she hefted the case and made her way towards the door, her steps resolute and her mind focused on the task at hand. Outside, the sounds of the battle raged on, the echoes of gunfire and the cries of the wounded filling the air. Sinclair paused for a moment, her eyes sweeping the devastated landscape, and she felt a surge of determination course through her veins. "This ends today," she muttered, her grip tightening on the case. Steeling her nerves, Sinclair stepped out into the fray, her movements swift and precise as she dodged the hail of bullets that rained down around her. The mercenaries, caught off guard by her sudden appearance, faltered, their attention divided between Sinclair and the ongoing dispersal. Seizing the opportunity, Sinclair charged forward, her eyes locked on a small, heavily armored vehicle that had been commandeered by the mercenaries. With a surge of adrenaline, she hurled the case into the vehicle's open hatch, her heart pounding as she watched it disappear into the depths. The mercenary leader, his face contorted with rage, lunged towards her, his weapon raised. But Sinclair was ready, and with a well-placed shot, she dropped him where he stood, her expression grim and resolute. As the mercenary leader's body crumpled to the ground, the rest of his men hesitated, their resolve wavering in the face of Sinclair's unwavering determination. She pressed her advantage, driving them back with a barrage of fire, her focus never wavering. In the distance, Sinclair could hear the faint sound of the aerosolized cure being dispersed, its fine mist drifting across the devastated landscape. A flicker of hope ignited within her, and she redoubled her efforts, her every shot finding its mark with deadly precision. Finally, as the last of the mercenaries were driven back, Sinclair allowed herself a moment of respite, her lungs burning with exertion. But the reprieve was short-lived, as the sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention. Turning, she found herself face to face with the mysterious woman from earlier, her expression unreadable. "It's done," Sinclair said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The cure is out there, and there's nothing they can do to stop it." The woman nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I knew you could do it. Now let's get you out of here. Your team is waiting." As Sinclair followed the woman through the rubble-strewn streets, a sense of cautious optimism began to take root. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Yet, in the face of such overwhelming adversity, Sinclair felt a glimmer of hope, the belief that humanity, against all odds, might just have a chance to prevail.